My own son tried to drug me on the day of my retirement, and I only caught him because I went to the kitchen for ice and saw him crushing pills into my whiskey. 40 years at Brennan Manufacturing, and this is how my boy wanted to celebrate my freedom, by slipping something into my drink like I was some kind of mark at a bar. If you've ever been betrayed by the person you'd die for, if you've ever seen your child's true colors in the worst possible moment, pour yourself something strong and settle in. This story's got more poison than my whiskey glass. And if you like tales about family that'll stab you in the back while hugging you from the front, hit that subscribe button for Grandpa's Diaries. I've got more stories about blood being thicker than water, and spoiler alert, sometimes that blood is contaminated. I'm always here with a fresh pot of coffee and some hard-earned wisdom about trusting the wrong people. I was supposed to be celebrating 40 years of getting up at 5 a.m., 40 years of breathing factory dust and managing crews twice my size, 40 years of building something solid for my family. The gold watch felt heavy in my pocket, and my supervisor's pension was finally kicking in after decades of wondering if I'd live long enough to enjoy it. Kevin had insisted on throwing me this party at my house, said it was time to honor the old man properly. But standing there in my own kitchen doorway, watching my 38-year-old son crush white pills with the back of a spoon and stir them into my good Kentucky bourbon, I realized this wasn't about honoring anybody. His hands weren't shaking from excitement. They were steady, practiced, like he'd done this before. The concentration on his face was the same look he'd had as a kid when he was up to something he knew was wrong. Kevin didn't see me watching from the shadow of the hallway. He was too focused on his work, making sure every grain of that powder dissolved completely into the amber liquid. Then he picked up my glass, the one with "World's Greatest Dad" etched into the side, a Father's Day gift from when he still looked at me like I hung the moon, and swirled it gently to mix everything together. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he'd hear it. This was my son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike and throw a curveball, the man I'd co-signed loans for when his insurance business was struggling, the same kid who used to fall asleep in my lap during Sunday football games, who called me every week after his mother died just to make sure I was eating right and taking my medications. I stepped back into the shadows as Kevin returned to the living room, carrying my poisoned drink with a smile that looked perfectly normal to everyone else. "Dad," he called out cheerfully, "your bourbon's ready. Let's make a toast to the hardest working man I know." The performance was flawless, loving son honoring his retiring father. But I'd seen behind the curtain, and now I knew exactly what kind of show Kevin was really putting on for our guests. Kevin wasn't always a schemer. There was a time when that boy was the light of my life. Back when Maggie was still alive, and our little house on Elm Street felt like the center of the universe. I remember teaching him to use my tools in the garage, his small hands wrapped around screwdrivers that were too big for him, determined to help Daddy fix whatever was broken. "I'm gonna be just like you when I grow up," he'd say, and my chest would swell with the kind of pride that makes a man feel 10 feet tall. Those were lean years, but good ones. I was working my way up from floor supervisor to department head at Brennan Manufacturing, and Maggie was teaching second grade at Roosevelt Elementary. Every dollar was accounted for, every purchase carefully considered, but we were building something solid. Kevin got new school clothes instead of hand-me-downs, piano lessons when he showed interest, baseball equipment when he made the Little League team. We sacrificed for him gladly, believing we were investing in a future that would make all the struggle worthwhile. High school Kevin was the kid every parent hopes for: honor roll student, varsity baseball player, respectful to adults and popular with his classmates. He dated Sarah Brennan, the plant owner's granddaughter, and I was proud that my son was good enough to catch the attention of a girl from Money. When he proposed to her senior year, old Harold Brennan actually asked for my blessing, treating me like an equal despite the difference in our bank accounts. "Your boy's got character, Bob," he said. "That's worth more than any trust fund." The wedding was beautiful, held at St. Mary's with a reception at the country club that Harold insisted on paying for. Kevin looked handsome in his rented tux, and Sarah was radiant in her grandmother's wedding dress. Maggie cried through the whole ceremony, happy tears for the life our son was starting. I walked him down the aisle in place of his deceased grandfather, and when I shook his hand at the altar, Kevin whispered, "Thanks for everything, Dad. I'm gonna make you proud." For a while it seemed like he would. Kevin started his insurance agency with a loan from Harold and some savings Maggie and I had scraped together over the years. Business was slow at first, but he worked hard, staying late at the office and networking at every community event. Sarah supported him completely, working part-time at the bank while taking care of their finances. They bought a nice house in Harold's neighborhood, invited us for Sunday dinners, and talked about grandchildren that would carry on the Mitchell name. But somewhere along the way, success went to Kevin's head. The insurance business took off during the housing boom, and suddenly he was making more money than I'd ever seen. Designer clothes replaced his modest wardrobe, expensive cars filled their driveway, and weekend trips to golf resorts became regular occurrences. He started talking about investments and tax shelters, using words I didn't understand to describe money moves that seemed too complicated for a simple man like me. The worst part was how he started looking at me differently, like I was some relic from his past instead of the man who'd raised him. My work stories became boring instead of interesting. My advice outdated instead of wise. When Maggie got sick, Kevin would visit the hospital in his expensive suits and write checks for her medical bills like he was doing us a favor instead of taking care of his mother. I appreciated the help, but I missed the son who would have sat by her bedside holding her hand instead of the businessman who treated her illness like another problem to solve with money. The changes in Kevin became impossible to ignore after Maggie's funeral. He'd started showing up at my house unannounced, always with some new concern about my well-being that felt more like surveillance than love. "Dad, you're getting older. Maybe it's time to think about making some changes," he'd say, scanning my living room like he was taking inventory. The conversations always circled back to my finances, my retirement plans, and whether I'd updated my will recently. Sarah would sit quietly during these visits, shooting Kevin warning looks when his questions got too pointed. I could see the embarrassment in her eyes when he'd comment on my outdated furniture or suggest I might be too set in my ways to manage my own affairs properly. Sometimes she'd change the subject or make excuses to cut their visits short, like she was trying to protect me from her own husband's growing avarice. The house visits became more frequent and more invasive. Kevin started bringing up my doctor's appointments, asking detailed questions about my prescriptions and whether I was managing them properly. He'd offer to help organize my medications, sort my mail, even suggested I might want to add his name to my bank accounts, just in case something happened. Every suggestion was wrapped in concern for my welfare, but I could see the hunger in his eyes when he looked at the family photos where Maggie wore her grandmother's jewelry. Last Christmas, Kevin brought me a stack of legal documents disguised as estate planning materials. He'd consulted with a lawyer friend, he said, and discovered that my current will was dangerously outdated and might create tax problems for my beneficiaries. "We just want to make sure everything's in order, Dad. You worked too hard for your money to see it eaten up by government red tape." The papers would have made him power of attorney over my finances, with authority to make medical decisions if I became incapacitated. I started noticing things missing from the house after his visits. Small items at first. Maggie's good silver, her jewelry box, a coin collection I'd inherited from my father. When I asked Kevin about them, he'd look concerned and suggest that maybe I was forgetting where I'd put things. "That's normal at your age, Dad. Mom used to misplace stuff all the time before she got really sick." The gaslighting was subtle but consistent, designed to make me question my own memory and judgment. The final warning sign came 3 weeks ago when Kevin brought me a new coffee maker, insisting my old one was probably harboring bacteria and might make me sick. He threw away my perfectly good machine and set up the new one himself, programming it with settings I didn't understand. That night, I felt dizzy and confused after my morning coffee, symptoms that lasted most of the day. When I mentioned it to Kevin during his next visit, he looked thoughtful and said, maybe it was time to have my blood pressure checked. But the worst part wasn't the stolen items or the suspicious coffee or even the legal documents. It was the way Kevin had started talking about me to other people, like I wasn't in the room. "Dad's getting a little forgetful," he'd tell the neighbors. "We're keeping an eye on him." To Harold Brennan at church, "I worry about him living alone. Sometimes I think he doesn't remember conversations we've had." He was building a narrative, creating witnesses to my supposed decline, laying the groundwork for something I was only now beginning to understand. The retirement party was Kevin's idea, but I should have known it was really an execution. He'd invited everyone who mattered, Harold Brennan and his wife, neighbors from the street, guys from my old crew at the factory, even Pastor Williams from St. Mary's. "Dad deserves a proper send-off," Kevin had announced to Sarah when he thought I couldn't hear. 40 years of hard work should be celebrated by people who appreciate what he's accomplished. But now I understood the real purpose. Maximum witnesses to see me in whatever condition that crushed-up medication was supposed to create. I rejoined the party carrying fresh ice, acting like nothing had happened while my mind raced through possibilities. Kevin handed me my poisoned whiskey with the same loving smile he'd perfected over months of manipulation. "Here's to the man who taught me everything about integrity and hard work," he announced, raising his own glass high. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife, but everyone else just saw a devoted son honoring his father. Harold Brennan stepped forward with his own drink, beaming with pride at what he thought was a beautiful family moment. "Bob, you've been like a brother to me all these years. Watching Kevin grow into the man he is today, seeing how he takes care of you, it makes an old man believe the next generation might just be all right." He clinked his glass against mine, the sound like a bell tolling for someone's funeral. I just wasn't sure yet if it would be mine or his. The conversation flowed around me while I pretended to sip my drink, letting the poisoned bourbon barely touch my lips. Kevin kept watching me carefully, checking to see if whatever he'd slipped me was taking effect. When I remained steady on my feet after 20 minutes, I saw a flicker of impatience cross his face. He suggested I might want to sit down and really enjoy my retirement celebration, guiding me toward my favorite chair like a funeral director positioning a corpse. Sarah was growing uncomfortable with Kevin's intense attention to my condition. She kept trying to draw him into conversations with other guests, but his focus remained locked on me. "Honey, maybe you should mingle a little," she whispered to him when she thought I couldn't hear. "People want to congratulate you on taking such good care of your father." But Kevin wasn't interested in congratulations. He was waiting for the show to begin. That's when Harold made his fatal mistake. The old man had been drinking steadily all evening, celebrating his son-in-law's success and his granddaughter's happy marriage. When he went to refresh his bourbon, he set his glass down on the side table next to mine while he told a long story about the early days of Brennan Manufacturing. The glasses were identical, heavy crystal tumblers that Maggie had received as a wedding gift 43 years ago. In that moment, watching Harold gesture expansively with his hands while Kevin monitored my every move, I made a decision that would change everything. With the smooth motion of a man who'd spent 4 decades working with his hands, I switched the glasses while Harold's back was turned. My poisoned bourbon went to him. His clean whiskey came to me. Kevin was so focused on watching for signs of my impairment that he never noticed the subtle swap that had just sealed someone else's fate entirely. For the next hour, I played the role of the grateful retiree while watching Harold unknowingly drink my poisoned bourbon. The old man was in fine form, telling stories about the early days of the manufacturing plant and how proud he was of Kevin's success in the insurance business. Every sip Harold took was another step deeper into Kevin's trap, and my son remained completely oblivious to the switch I'd made while he was busy calculating his inheritance. Harold was a tough old bird, 72 years old, but still sharp as a tack and strong as an ox from 50 years of running his own business. Whatever Kevin had slipped into that drink was taking longer to affect him than it would have me, but I could see the subtle changes beginning. His stories grew longer and more rambling. His movements became slightly unsteady, and his usually precise speech started slurring around the edges. Kevin was getting agitated. He kept glancing at me expectantly, waiting for signs of confusion or weakness that weren't coming. At one point, he actually asked if I was feeling all right, if maybe I wanted to lie down for a few minutes. "I'm fine, son," I told him, raising my clean glass of whiskey. "Never felt better. Retirement suits me already." The frustration in his eyes was almost comical. His carefully planned scheme was falling apart, and he had no idea why. Sarah was the first to notice something was wrong with her grandfather. Harold had been trying to tell a story about negotiating union contracts in the 1980s when he lost his train of thought mid-sentence, staring blankly at the wall like he'd forgotten where he was. "Grandpa Harold?" Sarah asked, touching his arm gently. "Are you feeling okay?" The concern in her voice was genuine. She had no idea her husband had just poisoned her grandfather. The deterioration accelerated quickly after that. Harold's speech became increasingly slurred, his coordination obviously impaired as he struggled to set down his glass without spilling. Pastor Williams suggested maybe the evening had been too much excitement for him, that perhaps someone should drive him home. But when Harold tried to stand up, His legs buckled and he collapsed back into his chair, looking confused and frightened. Kevin's face went pale as he realized something had gone terribly wrong with his plan. This wasn't supposed to happen to Harold. The old man wasn't supposed to be affected at all. I could see the wheels turning in Kevin's head as he tried to figure out how his foolproof scheme had backfired. Sarah was calling for someone to phone an ambulance while Harold mumbled incoherently about feeling dizzy and nauseous. The party atmosphere evaporated as people gathered around Harold, trying to help him stay conscious while we waited for paramedics. Kevin stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, his face a mask of panic and confusion. He kept looking back and forth between Harold and me, unable to understand why his father-in-law was incapacitated, while his intended victim remained perfectly fine. The irony was beautiful in its completeness. Kevin's greed had poisoned the very man whose money had funded his success, and he was helpless to stop the consequences of his own actions unfolding in front of everyone who mattered in his life. The ambulance arrived within 10 minutes, but it felt like hours as we all watched Harold slip in and out of consciousness. The paramedics worked efficiently, checking his vital signs and asking questions that Kevin couldn't answer without incriminating himself. Has he taken any new medications today? Any unusual symptoms before this evening? Could he have accidentally ingested something? Each question made Kevin's face grow paler as he realized how deep he'd dug his own grave. At the hospital, the doctors ran tests while Sarah paced the waiting room in tears, holding Harold's wife Eleanor, who'd arrived looking frantic and confused. Kevin sat in the corner, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. I sat next to Sarah, playing the concerned family patriarch, while inside I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was being served, but it was tearing apart what was left of my family in the process. Dr. Peterson emerged from the emergency room with a puzzled expression and some very interesting news. Harold had been poisoned with a combination of sedatives that could have been fatal given his age and heart condition. It's unusual, the doctor explained to the assembled family. These medications aren't typically found together except in very specific circumstances. We'll need to report this to the police as a potential case of intentional poisoning. Sarah immediately turned to Kevin, confusion and horror dawning on her face. Kevin, you were in charge of the drinks tonight. You were the one making sure everyone had what they needed. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a woman realizing her husband might be capable of something unthinkable. Grandpa Harold was drinking the same bourbon as Dad. How could this happen? That's when I decided it was time to speak up. Kevin, I said quietly, making sure everyone in the waiting room could hear me. Is there something you want to tell us about what happened tonight? The color drained completely from his face as he realized I knew exactly what he'd done. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. The police arrived an hour later, drawn by the hospital's mandatory reporting of suspected poisoning cases. Detective Morrison was a thorough woman who'd seen enough family disputes to recognize the signs of something rotten beneath the surface. She interviewed each of us separately, asking detailed questions about the evening's events and everyone's relationship with Harold. When she got to Kevin, his story was full of holes and nervous contradictions that made her eyebrows rise higher with each inconsistency. The breakthrough came when they searched my house as part of their investigation. Kevin had been careless with the pill bottles, leaving them in my kitchen trash where the police found them easily. The prescription labels showed they belonged to Kevin himself, anxiety medication and sleeping pills that he'd been stockpiling for months. When confronted with this evidence, Kevin finally broke down and confessed, but he tried to claim it was all a terrible mistake. I was just trying to help Dad sleep better, he sobbed to Detective Morrison while Sarah stared at him in horror. He's been having trouble since Mom died, and I thought maybe if he relaxed a little. I never meant for anyone else to get hurt, but the amount of medication found in Harold's system told a different story. This wasn't about helping anyone sleep. This was about incapacitation, about creating a vulnerable old man who couldn't protect his assets from a greedy son-in-law. The only question was whether Kevin had been planning to rob me or simply wait for me to die from an accidental overdose. 6 months later, I'm sitting in Harold's living room, both of us older and wiser from our brush with Kevin's greed. The old man recovered completely from the poisoning, though it took weeks for the medications to fully clear his system. He jokes now that Kevin accidentally did him a favor. The forced hospital stay revealed some heart problems that might have killed him if left untreated. Your boy nearly murdered me, he chuckles over coffee, but he also saved my life. That's got to be some kind of irony. Kevin got 18 months in minimum security prison for assault with a dangerous substance, plus probation and mandatory counseling for what the judge called a profound betrayal of family trust. Sarah divorced him before he even went to trial, moving back in with Harold and Eleanor while she rebuilt her life. She stops by to check on me sometimes, still carrying the shame of being married to someone who tried to poison his own father. I should have seen the signs, she always says, but I tell her some evil hides behind smiles that look like love. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was understanding how long Kevin had been planning it. The police investigation revealed months of preparation, researching my medications, consulting with lawyers about inheritance laws, even taking out a life insurance policy on me that I never knew existed. The coffee maker he'd given me was rigged with a timer that would have delivered regular doses of sedatives, slowly creating the appearance of dementia that would justify putting him in control of my finances. Harold and I have become unlikely friends through this mess, two old men who survived the same predator and lived to tell about it. He's changed his will to protect his assets from any future fortune hunters, setting up trusts that can't be touched by marriage or manipulation. I've done the same, leaving my money to the church and a scholarship fund for kids whose parents work manufacturing jobs. Kevin will get nothing except the knowledge that his greed cost him everything that actually mattered. The retirement watch still sits on my dresser, a reminder of 40 years of honest work and the bitter lesson that blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. Some nights I wonder if there were signs I missed, moments when I could have seen the rot growing in my son's character. But then I remember that some people choose their own darkness, and no amount of good parenting can save them from themselves. Sarah brought me pictures last week of the new life she's building. A job at Harold's company, night classes to finish her business degree, plans for a future that doesn't include Kevin's schemes and lies. He used to say he learned everything from you, she told me. But somewhere along the way, he forgot the most important lesson about integrity. She's right. I taught Kevin how to work hard and provide for his family, but I couldn't teach him to be satisfied with enough. Looking back on that retirement party, I realize I saved 2 lives that night, Harold's and my own. Kevin's poison would have worked eventually, whether that night or the next morning when I drank my doctored coffee. Instead, his greed poisoned the one relationship that had funded his success, and justice served itself with a perfection I never could have planned. Sometimes the best revenge isn't something you plot. It's just letting someone's evil destroy them while you step out of the way.